No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. So begins The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. One of my favorite opening sentences of any book, of any era, of any genre of all time. So, take a walk with me, but let's walk lightly so that we may not disturb whatever or whoever walks there, what walks alone. Permit me, if you will, to read a little more of that first paragraph, the first sentence I've already read. One more time. No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years, and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone. Not only do I love the first sentence of this book, but I love this entire first paragraph, which will actually be repeated later on. And it will also be subverted when you begin to learn about the structure of Hill House and how the angles are slightly off and the stairs are not level and everything is just kind of slightly askew. Shirley Jackson, her second to last novel. You probably know Shirley Jackson from the short story The Lottery, which I'm sure you had to read that in school. I had to read it in school. Millions and billions of children everywhere had to read that story in school. I actually really liked that story. Of all the required reading that we had to do in school, short story-wise anyway, there were really only two stories that ever stayed with me. And one of those was The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, and the other one was The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula Guin. Those stories both really opened my eyes to the magical world of literature. Shirley Jackson was not widely read, except for The Lottery, until a few years ago when Netflix adapted The Haunting of Hill House for their miniseries. And then all of a sudden, oh, look at this, Penguin, with their eye for design, no pun intended, came out with this series of horror classics, the Rambling series introduction by Guillermo del Toro, and included The Haunting of Hill House. So she now is finding a much larger readership. Another great book that she wrote is called We Have Always Lived in the Castle. That was her final novel. This one is very similar, and if you like The Haunting of Hill House, I would recommend We Have Always Lived in the Castle as well. And it also has an introduction from 2006 by Laura Miller, a journalist, which will completely spoil this book. So I would recommend, if you have this edition, please read the introduction after you read the story, because it will spoil the crap out of every scene, especially the ending. But it's a really good introduction and it's very insightful. The Haunting of Hill House is a small novel. It's thin, it moves right along. Right after that opening paragraph, we meet Dr. Montague, who is a paranormal researcher who's very frustrated with the academic community because they don't take him seriously and he can't seem to get his work published in academic journals. And he sees Hill House as a potential breakthrough, and he wants to demonstrate the spiritual phenomena that he's heard about there. So he sends out letters, and he receives 4 replies, and only 2 people end up showing up. They are Eleanor Vance and a woman named Theodora, who has just a singular name a mononym. And also, because he's conducting research in the house, the family insists on sending one of their family members, which is Luke. Luke Crane, I think. It's the Crane family who owns Hill House. And so Dr. Montague, Eleanor, Theodora, and Luke all meet up at the house. And I love the introductions to these characters. Shirley Jackson has such a way with wit and brevity and just an absolute keen ability to paint these people into your mind. And so they all remain quite singular and quite memorable, especially Eleanor, who is the main character. Let me just read you a little bit of the introductions of the characters. Eleanor Vance was 32 years old when she came to Hill House. The only person in the world she genuinely hated now that her mother was dead was her sister. She disliked her brother-in-law and her 5-year-old niece, and she had no friends. This was owing largely to the 11 years she had spent caring for her invalid mother, which had left her with some proficiency as a nurse, and an inability to face strong sunlight without blinking. She could not remember ever being truly happy in her adult life. Her years with her mother had been built up devotedly around small guilts and small reproaches, constant weariness and unending despair. Without ever wanting to become reserved and shy, she had spent so long alone with no one to love that it was difficult for her to talk, even casually, to another person, without self-consciousness and an awkward inability to find words. Yes, I can relate to you, Eleanor. I have spent so long living abroad that I seem to be losing my vocabulary in English, and I also am an awkward person who has the inability to find the words that he wants to use and cannot seem to communicate with any other human beings most of the time. But I love this next part. Her name had turned up on Dr. Montague's list because one day, when she was 12 years old and her sister was 18, and their father had been dead for not quite a month, showers of stones had fallen on their house without any warning or any indication of purpose or reason, dropping from the ceilings, rolling loudly down the walls, breaking windows and pattering maddeningly on the roof. The stones continued intermittently for 3 days, during which time Eleanor and her sister were less unnerved by the stones than by the neighbors and sightseers who gathered daily outside the front door, and by their mother's blind, hysterical insistence that all of this was due to malicious, backbiting people on the block who had had it in for her ever since she came. After 3 days, Eleanor and her sister were removed to a house of a friend, and the stones stopped falling, nor did they ever return. And basically, they forget all about this incident, which is a little bit funny because they were old enough that you would think that they would continue to remember, but I guess they sort of blocked it out of their memory. It goes on to talk about how Eleanor has been waiting for something to happen to her. Her whole life caring for her mother, she's always been waiting for her life to begin. And when Dr. Montague's letter comes in the mail, she is so excited and so overwhelmed that she just absolutely has to take this opportunity because her mother has recently passed away and nothing is happening for her. She doesn't have any money, and she ends up taking the car that she shares with her sister. Her sister will not let her borrow the car, but she ends up secretly taking the car, and she heads off to Hill House to take this opportunity to become an assistant to the paranormal research. Now let's move on to Theodora's introduction, page 7. Theodora, that was as much name she used. Her sketches were signed Theo, and on her apartment door, the window of her shop, and her telephone listing, and her pale stationery, and the bottom of the lovely photograph of her which stood on the mantel, the name was always only Theodora. Theodora was not like Eleanor. Duty and conscience were, for Theodora, attributes which belonged properly to Girl Scouts. Theodora's world was one of delight and soft colors. She had come onto Dr. Montague's list because, going laughing into the laboratory, bringing with her a rush of floral perfume, she had somehow been able, amused and excited over her own incredible skill, to identify correctly 18 cards out of 20, 15 cards out of 20, 19 cards out of 20, held up by an assistant, out of sight and hearing. The name of Theodora shone in the records of the laboratory, and so came inevitably to Dr. Montague's attention. And out of curiosity, she decides to take the chance. Theodora is not particularly psychic, but she does have some kind of an intuition. That doesn't really come into play much later, except for she has a great deal of empathy for especially Eleanor, and she seems almost like a big sister, caring for Eleanor, who is a bit childlike and is sort of immature, I guess. There's been a lot of speculation around whether or not Theodora is a lesbian. She has a friend that she lives with, and they seem to have a bit of a lover's quarrel. And I'm not really sure about that. There wasn't enough information for me to really think either way, and I don't really know if we need to know. I mean, I think it's fine to just leave it ambiguous. Theodora herself is so singular, and each of these characters has a lot of problems. They all seem to have bad relationships with their mother, which, of course, Shirley Jackson also had a pretty contentious relationship with her own mother. And yeah, so anyway, let's move on to Luke Sanderson. Luke Sanderson, not Luke Crane. Sorry. Anyway, it's the Crane family house, and Luke is one of the descendants, but he's not Luke Crane. He's Luke Sanderson. I'm sorry, I messed that up before. I love this, though. I love this introduction of Luke. Luke Sanderson was a liar. He was also a thief. His aunt, who was the owner of Hill House, was fond of pointing out that her nephew had the best education, the best clothes, the best taste, and the worst companions of anyone she had ever known. She would have leaped at any chance to put him safely away for a few weeks. The family lawyer insists that they should have a member of the family in the house while the paranormal investigation is going on, and there's nothing really of value that Luke can steal other than maybe the silverware. And so we don't really see his thieving qualities, except we do see his deception a few times. He is very good at lying, and he's very good at manipulating the others. But anyway, I just love all of those character introductions. I think they're just so simple, so brief, just a few paragraphs, and you really feel like you have such an insight into them. And the rest of it will come out in the dialogue. The dialogue in this book is absolutely masterful. It's a bunch of banter. It's conversations seemingly about frivolous subjects and people telling lies and making jokes and very sarcastic remarks, and yet it says so much about each one of the characters in such a deep way. Shirley Jackson absolutely is a master dialogue writer. Chapter 4. It was the first genuinely shining day of summer, a time of year which brought Eleanor always to aching memories of her early childhood, when it had seemed to be summer all the time. She could not remember a winter before her father's death on a cold, wet day. She had taken to wondering lately, during these swift-counted years, what had been done with all those wasted summer days. How could she have spent them so wantonly? I am foolish, she told herself, early every summer. I am very foolish. I am grown up now, and know the values of things. Nothing is ever really wasted, she believed sensibly, even one's childhood. And then, each year, one summer morning, the warm wind would come down the city street where she walked, and she would be touched with the little cold thought, I have let more time go by. And so this is one of the things that I find about Eleanor. She's very, very sensitive, and she's very much attached to her childhood. From the age of 20 or so, she started caring for her mother when her mother got sick, and she is now in her 30s, and she hasn't really been able to live. Her young adulthood has been completely taken away by caring for her mother, and all of those years are just gone without any social interaction, without any experiences. No wonder she's awkward, and she kind of lives in her imagination. I've read some reviews of Hill House that said Eleanor is a timid, mousy woman, but I didn't really get that. What I got was that she is very, very sensitive, and she just tries her absolute hardest to relate to the people around her, and she tries to keep up with the conversations of those who are in Hill House, her companions. And it's difficult for her, but she banters, and whenever she feels lost, she kind of makes up things. As she's driving along toward Hill House, she's fantasizing about all of these old houses and tumble-down mansions that she's passing. And some of that will come back later when Theodora or Luke asks her about herself, and she'll pull out these elements that she imagined and tell them about her little apartment or the place where she lived with her mother or whatever. And it will come back in these, she's essentially lying, but I think she can't help it. She's just in this kind of fantasy world because her entire life, she didn't want what she got, and she was kind of forced into dreaming. She's been dreaming her life. So I don't think she's mousy or timid. I think she's very sensitive and a bit unstable. And she's overwhelmed, very easily overwhelmed. And I also think she's stronger than a lot of reviewers give her credit for. The story seems to focus on Eleanor quite a bit. And although she gets into a lot of trouble, she also attempts to persevere. Even as her own psyche is crumbling around her, she tries very hard to hang on. And that's something that I don't think the mousy, timid thing really works for me, especially considering that. Next, on page 28, she finally gets to the gates, and she has this kind of overwhelming feeling of like, this is my chance to sort of get out, when the gate is locked and the caretaker comes there and they have this kind of weird, awkward conversation. And she has to kind of insist that she's invited and she's allowed to be there. He reluctantly lets her in. And then she feels this kind of dread of being there. And that, of course, is foreshadowing the horror that is to come. That's chapter 5. And at the end of chapter 5, it says, "The house was vile. She shivered and thought, the words coming freely into her mind, Hill House is vile. It is diseased. Get away from here at once." That's when she comes around the drive and she sees the house with its mad face. And she just thinks, she's got to get out of there. And then part 2. This book has, seven sections. And I love this at the beginning of part 2 on page 32. "No human eye can isolate the unhappy coincidence of line and place which suggests evil in the face of a house, and yet somehow a maniac juxtaposition, a badly turned angle, some chance meeting of roof and sky, turned Hill House into a place of despair, more frightening because the face of Hill House seemed awake, with a watchfulness from blank windows and a touch of glee in the eyebrow of a cornice." I didn't know what a cornice was, but damn, that's a good description right there of the mad face of the house. I love that. And still in Eleanor's mind, there's the sick voice saying, "Get away, get away." It's also here in part 2 that we begin to hear this phrase that is sort of stuck in Eleanor's mind, and it will come back many, many times repetitively. And it is "Journey's End in Lover's Meeting," which is from 12th Night. And there's different snippets of it that have been sort of running through her mind, but as she steps onto the bottom step, she has this deep unwillingness to touch Hill House for the first time because she feels like it's waiting for her, evil but patient. "Journey's end in lover's meeting," she thought, remembering her song at last. So before that, she's been repeating this, "In delay there lies no plenty. Present mirth hath present laughter." And all of these are from the same song. It's a song called "O Mistress Mine, Where Are You Roaming?" And it's sung in 12th Night. The repeated use of Shakespeare's song or poem underscores themes of desire and the search for belonging. I think it reflects the character's longing and connection for resolution, contrasting with the eerie and isolating nature of Hill House, where journeys often end in madness. After all, what is love but a kind of madness? At first, overwhelming, and you don't really know where you even are, overcome completely, and you don't see things maybe the way they really are, the irrationality of it. And so Shirley Jackson is always playing with these dichotomies, the madness and the embrace of Hill House and how comfortable it is, and how much the Hill House, the insane house itself, might want these people to stay there, and it tries to be as comfortable as possible for them and give them a good night's sleep in the hopes that they'll never leave. And there's just so many of these wonderful the tension between these different ideas and these different moments. I don't know if I can do justice to the housekeeper, Mrs. Dudley, in this video, but it's just really, she's kind of one of probably my favorite of the very minor characters. She has this really strange, very robotic, just completely inhuman way of talking. Mrs. Dudley shows Eleanor to her room, and then she has this sort of almost like a mantra that she repeats many times. Mrs. Dudley turned aside to let Eleanor come in and spoke apparently to the wall. "I set dinner on the dining room sideboard at 6 sharp, she said. "You can serve yourselves. I clear up in the morning. I have breakfast ready for you at 9. That's the way I agreed to do. I can't keep the rooms up the way you'd like, but there's no one else you could get that would help me. I don't wait on people. What I agreed to, it doesn't mean I wait on people." Eleanor nodded, standing uncertainly in the doorway. "I don't stay after I set out dinner," Mrs. Dudley went on. "Not after it begins to get dark. I leave before dark comes." "I know," Eleanor said. "We live over in the town 6 miles away." "Yes," Eleanor said, remembering Hillsdale. "So there won't be anyone around if you need help." "I understand." "We couldn't even hear you in the night." "I don't suppose no one could. No one lives any nearer than the town. No one else will come any nearer than that." "I know," Eleanor said tiredly. "In the night," Mrs. Dudley said, and smiled outright. "In the dark," she said, and closed the door behind her. Eleanor almost giggled, thinking of herself calling, "Oh, Mrs. Dudley, I need your help in the dark." And then she shivered. And this is the first time we hear Mrs. Dudley talk like this, but she will say this again and again. And no matter what the other characters say to her, she just keeps repeating these same sort of facts about when she sets out the dinner and when she cleans up and how she won't be there at night. And it just makes for such a bizarre, unsettling character. And I just love it so much, and I'm not even sure why I love it. It's just so weird. Fast forward a couple pages when Theodora and Eleanor are talking with Mrs. Dudley. So Mrs. Dudley leads Theodora into the green room. Theodora arrives shortly after Eleanor. And Eleanor's in the blue room with a connecting bathroom, and Theodora's in the green room. "Good Lord," Theodora said, looking sideways at Eleanor. "How perfectly enchanting, a positive bower." "I set dinner on the dining room sideboard at 6 sharp, Mrs. Dudley said. "You can serve yourselves. I clear up in the morning. I have breakfast ready for you at 9. That's the way I agreed to do." "You're frightened," Theodora said, watching Eleanor. "I can't keep the rooms up the way you'd like, but there's no one else you could get that would help me. I don't wait on people. What I agreed to do, it doesn't mean I wait on people." "It was just when I thought I was all alone," Eleanor said. "I don't stay after 6, not after it begins to get dark." "I'm here now," Theodora said, "so it's all right." "We have a connecting bathroom," Eleanor said absurdly. "The rooms are exactly alike." And Eleanor says, "I've never seen such awful places in my life," Eleanor said, her voice rising. "Like the very best hotels," Theodora said, "or any good girls' camp." "I leave before dark comes," Mrs. Dudley went on. "No one can hear you if you scream in the night," Eleanor told Theodora. She realized she was clutching at the doorknob and, under Theodora's quizzical eye, unclenched her fingers and walked steadily across the room. "We'll have to find some way of opening these windows," she said. "So there won't be anyone around if you need help," Mrs. Dudley said. "We couldn't hear you, even in the night. No one could." "All right now?" Theodora asked, and Eleanor nodded. "No one lives any nearer than the town. No one else will come any nearer than that." "You're probably just hungry," Theodora said, "and I'm starved myself." She set her suitcase on the bed and slipped off her shoes. "Nothing," she said, "upsets me more than being hungry. I snarl and snap and burst into tears." She lifted a pair of softly tailored slacks out of the suitcase. "In the night," Mrs. Dudley said. She smiled. "In the dark," she said, and closed the door behind her. After a minute, Eleanor said, "She also walks without making a sound." "Delightful old body," Theodora turned, regarding her room. Anyway, this video, I don't know how long this video is going to be. I spent way too much time talking about Mrs. Dudley, but I just love the weird, unsettling quality. And Hill House does take a little while to get going, but there's all of these ominous little glimpses that come in. Even when Eleanor's in the town, she stops by a little diner. There's a girl behind the counter, there's a guy drinking his coffee, and then Eleanor is there. hating the coffee. "Do you have a lot of visitors around here?" she asked when the girl had filled the coffee cup and gone back to lounge against the shelves. "Tourists, I mean? What for?" For a minute, the girl flashed at her from what might have been an emptiness greater than any Eleanor had ever known. "Why would anybody come here?" She looked sullenly at the man and added, "There's not even a movie." And that is such a tiny moment. For a minute, the girl flashed at her from what might have been an emptiness greater than any Eleanor had ever known. And what flashes, or what, this is Eleanor's sensitivity, and this is the ominous quality of the town that surrounds the haunted mansion. This is only page 24, and already these little things are coming in there. And yet nothing really happens outright until maybe halfway through the book. As soon as they're all together, and the doctor has his martini that he's disappointed. Luke made him a martini and it's not good enough, and the others are drinking brandy, and they're sitting around this little fireplace in this very dark room. Luke and the doctor begin to play chess. Eleanor gets drunk very easily, and she starts to wonder if she's just dreaming. Maybe this is all a dream. She's just imagining all of this. And there are several moments when the idea that this is all happening inside of Eleanor's psyche, and maybe the other characters don't really exist, or maybe these hallucinations are just all in her mind. But I disagree with that, because there are too many moments where the other characters are, interacting with her and taking care of her, and, they're also experiencing these psychic phenomena. So I am on the side where this is a story of a true haunted house, and it's happening to these people. Is Eleanor the cause of the haunted house? Is the house itself completely insane? Is it some kind of maybe both? Eleanor has this poltergeist attached to her from when she was a child, and the stones were raining on her house. She brings that poltergeist out when she reaches Hill House, or the house, the insanity of the house pulls it out of her. Maybe any of those things are possible. It's not until the 6th chapter of part 4 when the real creepiness begins. And I thought about maybe reading some excerpts from it, but I think I'm going to just leave it up to you, because as much as I love these creepy little moments, there's not many of them. And each one really deserves to kind of stand on its own in your own imagination. And I really don't want to spoil anything. But I love the fact that Shirley Jackson is always taking, again, the dichotomy and the tension between, like love and madness, or comfort and pain, and, these lonely, desperate people who find companionship in this very dark and unsustainable situation. And there's another creepy scene where Eleanor and Theodora are out at night, and the trees start to almost become like a negative photograph. All the black trees turn white, and they are walking near this river, and they come around the corner, and there's this like Technicolor, bright, sunny day picnic going on. This family's having a picnic there, and they're very surprised and whatever. And they start to realize that something's wrong, and Eleanor realizes that there's something behind them, and they start to run. And Theodora says, "Don't look back, don't look back." And Eleanor can't help herself, and she looks back. But we never, this is a minor spoiler, but we never find out exactly what she saw that was so absolutely terrifying. And even just talking about that, like, I get goosebumps, because it's like, what the hell was that? And there's a lot of wonderful sequences in the book where Shirley Jackson gives you just enough. And there's these, something moving up and down the hallway, or maybe some creature, maybe a dog or some, feral animal running through the house, or these kinds of things. But they're never really nailed down. And there's always a degree of ambiguity. And I think that's what really makes this story special. I read horror casually. I'm not a huge horror guy, but I love this for the entertainment more than the spooky horror side. Of course, without the spooky horror, it's just a bunch of people like stuck in a house. But it's not all about the horror for me. I mean, those ghostly elements and the haunted elements are wonderful, and they're terrifying. But it's also just such a great story, and there's such great characters. If you want to learn how to write dialogue, you could do worse than studying The Haunting of Hill House and Shirley Jackson in general. You should read The Haunting of Hill House if you've never read it, especially if you've ever watched the Netflix miniseries. It's quite different. Don't think it's the same. It's kind of like The Shining, like the book and the miniseries can both be appreciated on their own merits. Highly, highly recommend in this spooky season, The Haunting of Hill House. All right. I'm sorry this video was like way too long. I'm trying to make shorter videos, but I just get so excited. I can't help myself. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you again.